In this video, I'm going to be going over what I think are the top 10 weapon abilities in Albion Online. Now, I don't have any official criteria that I'm rating these on. These are just my random personal opinions about what I feel about different spells in the game. Starting us off at number 10, we have Devastating Combo. Devastating Combo is a W ability on War Gloves. You target an enemy and channel for 1 second, punching them 2 times. The first one stuns for 1.1 seconds and does damage, and then the second one knocks back a short distance, also doing damage. The number one reason why I have this on the list of the top 10 most overpowered strongest abilities in the game is simply its damage is so high. The damage on this one W does the same damage as like the Raven Strike's E, and it's higher than the Brawler Gloves E ability. In terms of single target damage, it is extremely high. Not to mention that it's also just point and click CC that not only stuns but also knocks back and combos into all of your other abilities super well. Basically, if you need to take down a single target, this W is one of the strongest abilities in the game. The only reason that this comes in at number 10 and not higher on our list is because as a single target W ability that is not a mobility spell, it is pretty situational. There aren't too many situations where you would actually take this ability, but when you do, it is, well, as the name suggests, devastating. At number 9, we have Throwing Blades. Throwing Blades is a W ability for daggers. You throw 3 blades in a little cone and they do a little bit of damage, but for every target hit you gain a stack that gives 15% damage and 15% move speed for 5 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. So daggers used to be this weapon line that was only used and only useful for solo and small scale gameplay, making this ability that rarely got its full value due to that small scale gameplay pretty much never really used and not really that strong. But then SBI went along and added some daggers that have good AoE damage and can be used in group fights, like the Bridled Fury and the Demon Fang. And well, these daggers have been like top tier meta for group DPS options since they've been released, and the reason why is simply because of this W. 45% damage and 45% move speed for 5 seconds is probably the best buff in the entire game. On any other weapon line, this would be unequivocally broken. It is what lets daggers exist in this group play. Daggers literally have to be balanced around this one specific ability just because of how powerful it is in a group environment. Coming in at number 8, we have one of the most recent spells added to the game in Chain Missile. Chain Missile is a Q ability for arcane staffs that shoots at a projectile in a line. If it hits something, it can bounce up to 2 times to hit 3 targets total. Each enemy it hits takes damage and receives a mark that you can consume by auto-attacking them, which deals extra damage. Why is this ability strong? Well, it does so much damage. If you were to hit this ability on 3 targets and auto-attack each one on cooldown, it would do as much damage as someone dropping a brimstone on your head over and over with no cooldown. Now, I'm not too sure how helpful that analogy actually is, but the point is, the consistent damage that this Q ability can output is absolutely insane. Compared to every single other consistent damage dealing spell in the game, this thing is just so much more reliable and just so much more damage, assuming they're not like 10 people stacked on top of each other. Really, for any activity that you want good consistent damage for, Arcane is going to be good or the best simply because of this Q ability. Coming in at number 7, we have Snare Charge. Snare Charge is a W ability found on maces that gives you an 11 meter long jump that does a little bit of damage in an AoE, as well as interrupting abilities and snaring. Now, what is there not to say about Snare Charge? It's a decent mobility spell and one of the best control abilities in the game. Theoretically, this could be a balanced ability if it wasn't so fast and didn't interrupt casting. When I say it's a jump, it's actually more of a blink for how fast it moves. Despite it being a CC from ranged, realistically you can't react to it. It's just too fast. And even if you do react to it, most of the stuff that would counter an ability like this just doesn't because it interrupts. Scholar sandals, for example, are like the shoes that you use to counter CC from tanks, like, snares and stuff, but against snare charge, they're completely useless because snare charge just interrupts them, meaning it's a ranged AoE hard CC that is basically uncounterable. And it's a short cooldown, so really it's just an oppressive ability that really needs to be looked at. Coming in at number 6, we have Holy Flash. Holy Flash is a Q ability found on Holy Staves, and it's a small AoE spell that heals up to 5 allies. Now, I don't play Holy Staves ever, so this should be rated higher, but this ability is just too much healing. If you are healing 2 targets, just 2, you are outputting more heals per second than you would if you were to use your single target Q. Meaning, there's practically no situation where you would ever use the single target Q in because this AoE Q is just so strong. Not to mention it's also on a longer cooldown, which generally speaking makes it better. Really, there's a reason Holies are the primary healers in Albion right now over nature, and something tells me it has something to do with this Q ability. It's just too much healing in too big of an AoE. Number 5, Deadly Swipe. Deadly Swipe is a Q ability on daggers, which lets you dash a short 5-meter distance and deal damage in an AoE, giving you a stack of Assassin's Spirit for every target hit. Another dagger ability that can receive very similar words to the previous one in Throwing Blades. As Throwing Blades sort of define the weapons for group play, Deadly Swipe defines the weapon for, well, literally everything. Daggers are literally fundamentally solely balanced around this Q ability. It is one of the very few AoE damage sources that daggers have, and even on single targets it's not that bad damage. It is really great mobility, and it's the only way for daggers to very quickly get stacks. It just genuinely gives the sort of dagger line and how they're played everything they would ever want. In fact, SBI literally had to completely kill an ability to make sure that daggers stayed somewhat balanced after they introduced Deadly Swipe. Really, when you talk about like a meta-defining ability or ability that defines a weapon line, Deadly Swipe is the quintessential example. It gives daggers everything they want in one simple, low cooldown Q ability. Coming in at number 4, we start getting into the really overpowered abilities that definitely either need a rework or a nerf. Number 4 is Thorn Growth. Thorn Growth is a Q ability on Nature Staves. You cast a small AoE on the ground up to 3 times that deals damage over time, slowing, and applies thorn charges to enemies that are caught in it. Auto-attacking enemies consumes a charge for extra damage, and this deals significantly more damage to mobs than it does to players. This spell single-handedly clears mobs faster than most entire weapons do, and in a big AoE if you consider all 3 of them. For consistent damage over time against mobs, it is top-notch, probably the best spell out there. But what makes it really overpowered is that it's attached to Nature Staves, a weapon line that has a ton of self-sustain naturally built in it. Why is this problematic? Well, if you attach a ton of self-sustain into really good consistent damage, it just sort of starts breaking down the fundamental rules of the game. It allows a solo player to easily clear group content because they have the self-sustain of a healer and the damage of a DPS all in one. And while I did talk about PvE for basically all of this, it is actually a pretty decent PvP spell too. Great for kiting, can box people pretty well. And just in general, if it was one of those spells that was on any other weapon line, it would probably be super busted. Coming in at number 3, we have Armor Piercer. Armor Piercer is a W spell for Cursed Staves that shoots out a beam, dealing damage and reducing resistances of everything hit by it. Spells that reduce resistances are classified as pierces, and pierces in Albion are very strong. They're one of the best types of debuff, as they make all damage considerably more effective, and in a game where coordinating and syncing damage is everything, that becomes extremely valuable. Because of this, big pierces are usually reserved for E abilities, Spirit Hunter, Damnation, Carving Sword, etc. Occasionally they're found on Qs, but those are either really small AoE or single target, and they pierce a lot less. There's only one exception. Armor Piercer on Curse Stabs is an extremely strong pierce on a W. It's instant cast, long range, low cooldown, pretty big pierce. On a W, it can basically do the job of some entire other weapons with one singular expendable W ability. Sure, it's not quite as strong as any of those E pierces by itself, but it's not that far away from them either. For example, the pierce amount is more than the Spirit Hunter and about as big as the Damnation. Now, it may be justified having such an insanely strong group play or group PvP ability on a W, similar to Throwing Blades on Dagger, because Curse Staves just aren't that strong in group play otherwise, more of being a sort of solo small-scale weapon line. But if any Curse Staves get buffed in their ability to take larger group fights, Armor Piercer is going to pose a massive problem and definitely would need to be looked at very quickly. Coming in at number 2, we have Gravitational Collapse. Gravitational Collapse is the E ability found on the Spiked Gauntlets, which are War Gloves. It hits in a large AoE, dealing damage and slowing. The damage and slow differs depending on the chest piece of the target. So if someone's in plate armor, they take a ton of damage and a huge slow, whereas someone in cloth will only take minimal damage and minimal slow. So when Spiked Gauntlets were introduced to the game, SPI, I'm guessing, sort of knew that they were a dangerous weapon to implement, and so they made them really weak. They basically made their damage super low and hoped they didn't get abused, and nobody really used them because their damage was just so low. SPI, not wanting to introduce a dead weapon from minute 1, decided to buff them a little bit to see if they give them some love. And it completely broke the game. If any of you played around the time where the Spiked Gauntlets got buffed in any sort of large or mid-scale group play, you know what I'm talking about. The game was complete chaos. Everybody was running around with like at least 50% of their DPS being Spiked Gauntlets and literally just one-shotting all of the tanks on the field. Seeing somebody in plate armor became extremely rare. You'd see people in gathering gear before you'd see plate armor just because of how extremely overpowered these Spiked Gauntlets were, making playing anything in plate armor basically impossible. Now, since then, SPI has hit the big red stop button. They nerfed them a little bit, but more importantly, they made it so that you cannot be affected by another Spiked Gauntlet if you've recently been affected by one in the last second. And while this did fix the absolute clown fiesta that was group PvP in Albion at the time, it's not a good solution to the game-breaking mechanic that the Spiked Gauntlets introduced to Albion. Fundamental to Albion PvP is that tanks can't be one-shot outside of extreme cases where like an entire Zerg is all hitting them at the same time. Spiked Gauntlets sort of break that because they do around like 3 DPS's worth of DPS to tanks all by themselves. It has made one-shotting tanks a thing in Albion now. You can one-shot tanks with a relatively small-scale party because of Spiked Gauntlets. That is why they rank so highly on the list. They are game-breaking, they're meta-defining, they need a rework. The quick fix was nice, but fundamentally they still have the same problem, just to a much lesser extent. They need to be changed in a way that respects the rules of Albion. Before we get into number 1, I have some honorable mentions that didn't quite make the list. First up, we have Aftershock, which is Realmbreaker's E ability, does a bunch of damage, knocks up, and reduces the max HP of enemies in an AoE. This thing is kind of similar to both Armor Piercer and the Spiked Gauntlet E Gravitational Collapse. It kind of lets you do like so much more damage to targets if they're hit by this Realmbreaker E. It's also super powerful in PvE, having a health reduction for mobs, so overall, it's just a fundamentally extremely strong ability. Our other honorable mention is Divine Intervention, which is the E ability on the Hallowfall, which lets you leap to a targeted area, healing people and knocking out enemies, and you are immune during this leap. I don't know why SPI thought it was a good idea to give a healer such an incredibly strong mobility, safety, spell that still allowed them to heal just as much as other healing sticks, but they did, and it's Hallowfall, and it is really, really strong, and basically used for all group PvP. Number 1, we have an ability that nobody expected, and everybody's going to disagree with me on, but I'm standing my ground. It is Sacred Ground. Sacred Ground is a Q ability found on maces. It puts a little purple pool on the ground that silences everything inside of it and slows it a little bit. The silence can only last 3 seconds long on mobs. What makes this ability OP? Well, there's no one feature of this ability that really makes it stand out as OP, but there's so many things that are just so unbelievably good about it. Starting off, the pool lasts for 6 seconds and it has a cooldown of 7 seconds, meaning with a little bit of cooldown reduction in your build, it is literally just permanently up. Also, silences in Albion are really, really strong, stupidly strong. Auto attacks are basically worthless minus a few very specific weapons, so a silence is almost just as strong as a stun a lot of the time. They're one of the best forms of crowd control. And on top of that, they're also the only form of crowd control that can interrupt uninterruptible abilities, so having an instant cast AoE silence becomes extremely strong, especially when it's on a short cooldown. Even more than this, SBI's environmental design loves choke point and corridor fights, which makes this ability shine. It is so hard to push a choke point or play in a corridor when there's just this pool that you can't do anything in. If you're fighting around a choke point or in a corridor, the amount of control that this one singular ability brings is kind of insane. And to top all of this off, it's on a Q ability. The only other weapon line that has a Q ability that even comes close to providing this much control is Arcane Stav's Magic Shock, which is also a silence. Like, if you look at weapon lines, especially tank weapon lines, strong control spells are basically always reserved for your W and your E's, because if they're on your Qs, and you have one on your W and your E as well, the amount of control you can bring to a fight is kind of dumb, and that's exactly what maces are. They just bring way too much control, and a lot of it is because they have an insanely powerful control spell on their Q. Their Q, I don't understand how SBI is just like okay with this. It adds just so much control in a fight from a singular person. Conceptually, this ability is the strongest in the game. Okay, so as I was editing this video, I realized that I somehow missed, when I was looking at all the abilities in the game, trying to figure out which ones I thought were the best, I somehow missed like literally the most overpowered ability in the entire game. So if you didn't like my number 1 choice, here's the real number 1, Great Arcane's ability Time Freeze. Basically, you cast it in a small AoE, and anything inside it becomes immune for 2 seconds. They also can't act during this time, so they're basically stunned and immune. What makes this ability so incredibly broken? Well, the fact that it has no counterplay. I mean, technically it has some very minor weird niche counterplay, but for an AoE defensive ability like are so common in Albion, it just has no counterplay that all the other ones have. You cannot purge or cleanse the time freeze off of enemies or allies, and it is an instant cast ability, so it's incredibly hard to stop someone from casting this on a clump that you're making, and once it casts, there's nothing you can do about it. Really, the only built-in counter to Great Arcane is that you cannot be affected by another Great Arcane for a certain amount of time after, so basically the only counter to Time Freeze is Time Freeze. All of this meaning it is the single most meta-defining weapon or ability to ever face Albion in its entire history for group play, for the clump and dump style that is so known in Albion's large group PvP. Also, another quick note just before we end this video, another thing happened while I was making this video is that SBI released their NDA patch notes for the next patch, and on it there's a bunch of abilities that are on this list that are getting nerfed. So many of these abilities are likely to be nerfed very quickly, others probably sometime in the future, or if you're watching this video late, they've probably been nerfed already. Anyway, those are my choices for the top 10 abilities, weapon abilities in the game, or technically top 13 I guess. Do you agree with this? Probably not. Do you disagree with this? Probably. Let's start an absolutely heated, vicious debate in the comments of this video.